Sarah Martinez never imagined that driving an ambulance through war zones would prepare her for the fight of her life. She thought her biggest challenge would be navigating bomb-damaged roads and dodging sniper fire while rushing wounded soldiers to safety. She was wrong. When enemy forces surrounded her medical convoy in the mountains of Afghanistan, Sarah found herself cut off from help, armed only with basic medical supplies and a pistol she'd barely trained with. What happened next would challenge everything the military thought they knew about courage, survival, and what happens when an ordinary person faces extraordinary circumstances. This is the story of how a 24-year-old woman from small-town Texas, whose only military training was in first aid and defensive driving, became a legend among the soldiers she saved. It's about split-second decisions, impossible odds, and discovering strength you never knew existed when lives depend on you. In 5 harrowing days, Sarah would transform from someone who avoided confrontation to someone who faced it head-on, proving that heroes aren't born in training camps or forged in boot camps. Sometimes, they're made in the back of an ambulance when everything goes wrong, and giving up isn't an option. Sarah Martinez had always been the type of person who helped others without thinking twice about it. Growing up in Sweetwater, Texas, population 10,000, she was the girl who stopped to help elderly neighbors carry groceries, who volunteered at the local animal shelter every weekend, and who somehow always knew exactly what to say when someone was hurting. Her friends used to joke that she had healing hands, but Sarah never thought much about it. To her, helping people just felt natural. When she turned 18, college seemed like the obvious choice, but the Martinez family didn't have money for tuition. Sarah's father worked construction when his back allowed it, and her mother cleaned houses around town. They were proud people who never asked for help, but Sarah could see the worry lines deepening around their eyes every time another bill arrived in the mail. The military recruiter who came to her high school graduation fair promised her a chance to serve her country while learning valuable medical skills. He talked about the training she'd receive, the steady paycheck, and the educational benefits that would help her become a nurse when her service ended. What he didn't mention was that she'd be driving through some of the most dangerous places on Earth, racing against time to save lives while enemy fighters tried to stop her. Sarah signed up to be a military ambulance driver because it seemed like the perfect fit for someone who wanted to help without having to hurt anyone. She imagined herself as a lifeline for wounded soldiers, someone who brought hope instead of destruction to the battlefield. During basic training, she excelled at everything medical-related. She could start in 4 in the back of a moving vehicle, perform CPR while under pressure, and keep calm when everyone around her was panicking. Her instructors noticed her natural ability to stay focused during emergencies, but they also noticed something else. Sarah avoided the combat training portions of her program whenever possible. She struggled with weapons training, not because she couldn't learn, but because she didn't want to. The idea of pointing a weapon at another human being, even in training, made her stomach turn. Her commanding officers noted this in her file, but since she was training for medical support rather than frontline combat, they didn't push the issue. After completing her training at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Sarah received orders to deploy to Afghanistan as part of a medical support unit. She spent her last week at home trying to memorize every detail of her family's faces, knowing she wouldn't see them for at least a year. Her younger brother Miguel, only 16, tried to act tough when she said goodbye, but she caught him crying in his room later that night. The flight to Afghanistan took 26 hours with multiple stops, and Sarah spent most of it reading medical manuals and trying not to think about what waited for her. She'd heard stories from other soldiers, but everyone said the same thing about serving in a war zone. You never really know what it's like until you're there. Her first month at Forward Operating Base Chapman was exactly what she'd expected. The base sat in a valley surrounded by mountains, and Sarah quickly learned that the beautiful landscape could hide deadly threats. She drove supply runs to smaller outposts, transported wounded soldiers to the main hospital, and slowly got used to the sound of helicopters overhead and the distant rumble of explosions. Her ambulance became like a second home to her. She knew every inch of the vehicle, from the location of each medical supply to the quirks of the engine that sometimes hesitated on cold mornings. Her partner was Corporal James Washington, a combat medic from Detroit who'd been in Afghanistan for 8 months already. James taught her the unofficial rules of staying alive. Never take the same route twice. Always carry extra water. And trust your gut when something feels wrong. The wounded soldiers they transported came from all over the country, and Sarah learned their stories during the rides to medical facilities. There was Private Collins from Oregon who'd stepped on an improvised explosive device while on patrol. Sergeant Rodriguez from California who'd been hit by shrapnel during a firefight. Each soldier had a family back home waiting for them, just like she did. Sarah made it her mission to keep them talking during transport, believing that staying conscious and connected helped their chances of recovery. 3 months into her deployment, Sarah had developed a reputation as one of the most reliable drivers in her unit. She never got lost, never panicked under pressure, and had never lost a patient during transport. Her commanding officer, Major Thompson, started requesting her specifically for the more challenging runs to remote outposts where the roads were dangerous and medical care was limited. These missions often took her convoy far from the main base, winding through mountain passes where communication was spotty and help was hours away. Sarah learned to read the landscape like a book, watching for signs of recent digging that might indicate hidden explosives, scanning the ridgelines for the glint of sunlight off metal that could mean sniper positions. During these longer missions, she worked with different teams of soldiers depending on what each outpost needed. Some trips involved transporting supplies to medics who hadn't been resupplied in weeks. Others required evacuating soldiers with serious injuries that couldn't be treated at smaller facilities. Each mission taught her something new about survival, about reading people's faces to understand their pain, and about making life-or-death decisions in seconds. Her fellow soldiers began to see her as more than just a driver. She was the person who remembered everyone's birthday, who shared her care packages from home, and who somehow always had exactly what someone needed in her medical kit. Sarah kept a small notebook where she wrote down details about each soldier she transported, their hometown, their family members' names, what they missed most about home. She believed that seeing them as complete people, not just patients, made her better at her job. The other drivers in her unit started coming to her for advice about difficult transports or tricky medical situations. Sarah never claimed to know more than the trained medics, but she had developed an instinct for reading patients and understanding what they needed beyond just medical care. Sometimes that meant holding someone's hand while they talked about their fear. Other times it meant distracting them with jokes or stories to keep their mind off the pain. As autumn approached, the attacks on supply convoys increased. Intelligence reports suggested that enemy forces were planning something significant, but nobody knew exactly what or when. Sarah noticed that her missions were becoming more dangerous, with more soldiers required for security and stricter protocols about communication and route planning. The mountains around their base grew colder as winter approached, and Sarah learned to pack extra blankets for patients who might go into shock from both their injuries and the dropping temperatures. She also started carrying additional emergency supplies, including extra ammunition for the security teams, though she hoped she'd never need to use the weapon training she'd tried so hard to avoid. During this time, Sarah received a letter from her brother Miguel telling her that he'd decided to enlist as soon as he turned 18. The letter filled her with both pride and terror. She was proud that her example had inspired him to serve, but terrified at the thought of him facing the same dangers she saw every day. She wrote back immediately, telling him about all the non-combat roles available in the military and encouraging him to consider medical training like hers. Her parents' letters always ended the same way. "Come home safe, Mija. We love you." Sarah kept every letter in a small box under her bunk, reading them when the stress of constant vigilance became overwhelming. The letters reminded her that there was a world beyond the war zone, a place where people worried about normal things like grocery bills and high school football games. As November arrived, bringing harsh mountain winds, and the first sign that something was wrong came 40 minutes into the drive, when Sarah's radio crackled with urgent voices from the lead security vehicle. Through the static, she heard Sergeant Miller, the convoy commander, reporting movement on the ridgeline above them. Sarah instinctively pressed harder on the accelerator while scanning the rocky slopes that rose steeply on both sides of the narrow mountain road. The landscape that had seemed beautifully rugged during previous trips now felt menacing and full of hidden threats. Every boulder could conceal an enemy fighter. Every curve in the road could hide an ambush. Sarah's hands tightened on the steering wheel as she tried to maintain the proper distance from the vehicle ahead while staying alert for the radio commands that might tell her to stop, speed up, or take evasive action. James sat beside her in the passenger seat, checking and rechecking their medical equipment while monitoring their own radio frequencies. Every few minutes, he would look up to scan the surrounding terrain through his window, his experience in previous deployments making him hyper-aware of potential danger signs. Both of them had been through situations where suspicious movement turned out to be nothing more than local shepherds or wildlife. But they also knew that taking any threat lightly could be fatal. The attack began without warning at exactly 2:47 in the afternoon. Sarah would remember the time precisely because she had just glanced at her watch, calculating that they should reach their destination in another hour. The first explosion came from somewhere ahead of their convoy, sending a column of black smoke and debris high into the air. The shockwave reached them seconds later, strong enough to rattle the windows of Sarah's ambulance. Her radio immediately exploded with shouted commands and status reports from the security vehicles. Through the chaos of overlapping voices, she heard that the lead vehicle had struck an improvised explosive device hidden in the road. Before she could fully process this information, automatic weapon fire erupted from multiple positions on the hillsides around them. Sergeant Miller's voice cut through the radio chatter with clear, urgent instructions for the convoy to reverse course immediately and head back toward the base. But as Sarah shifted into reverse and began backing up along the narrow mountain road, more explosions erupted behind them. The enemy had planned their attack carefully, using explosives to block both ends of a 2-mile stretch of road and trapping the entire convoy in what military tacticians call a kill zone. The sound of bullets striking metal filled the air as Sarah struggled to maneuver her ambulance in the limited space available on the mountain road. James was shouting into his radio, trying to coordinate with the other vehicles while calling for air support and medical evacuation helicopters. Through her mirrors, Sarah could see soldiers from the security vehicles taking defensive positions behind their trucks and returning fire toward the hillsides. The second improvised explosive device detonated just as Sarah was turning her ambulance around. The blast wave hit her vehicle from the side, shattering the driver's side window and filling the cab with dust and debris. The concussion left her ears ringing and her vision blurred, but somehow she managed to keep the ambulance upright and under control. When her vision cleared, Sarah realized that their situation had become desperate. The convoy was trapped between two destroyed sections of road, taking fire from enemy positions that seemed to surround them completely. The security vehicles were returning fire, but they were clearly outnumbered and had no way to call for immediate support in the remote mountain location where cell phone signals couldn't reach and radio communication was spotty at best. James had been thrown against his door when the explosion hit, and blood was running down the side of his face from a cut on his forehead. But he was still conscious and still trying to coordinate their response on the radio. Through the broken window, Sarah could hear him shouting updates to anyone who might be listening, describing their position and requesting immediate assistance. The reality of their situation hit Sarah like a physical blow. She was trapped in a combat zone with limited ammunition, no way to escape, and responsibility for keeping her ambulance and its medical supplies available for wounded soldiers who would need her help. Everything she had trained for had prepared her to transport patients safely, not to fight for survival while under direct enemy attack. Bullets continued to strike their ambulance, and Sarah realized that the thin metal walls provided almost no protection against the high-powered rifles being used against them. She made a split-second decision to drive the ambulance behind a large boulder formation that offered better cover, even though it meant leaving the defensive formation that the security vehicles had established. As she maneuvered toward the rocks, Sarah saw Corporal Davidson from one of the security vehicles stumble and fall. Blood was spreading across his uniform from what looked like a serious wound to his leg. Without thinking about the danger, Sarah stopped her ambulance and shouted to James that they had a casualty who needed immediate help. James looked at her as if she'd lost her mind. Moving away from their protected position to help Davidson would expose them to direct enemy fire from multiple directions. But Sarah was already grabbing her medical kit and preparing to leave the relative safety of the ambulance cab. Her training and instincts as a medic overrode her fear, just as it had been designed to do. The next few minutes became a blur of action that Sarah would replay in her memory thousands of times afterward. She sprinted from her ambulance to Davidson's position while bullets struck the ground around her feet. Reaching the wounded soldier, she immediately began applying pressure to his leg wound while calling for James to bring additional medical supplies from their ambulance. Davidson was conscious, but going into shock from blood loss. Sarah worked quickly to stop the bleeding and started 4 to replace lost fluids, but she knew that he needed surgical care that she couldn't provide in the field. Meanwhile, the firefight continued around them, with enemy positions maintaining steady fire that kept all the American soldiers pinned down behind whatever cover they could find. It was while she was treating Davidson that Sarah first noticed how the enemy attack was organized. The fighters weren't firing randomly or trying to overrun the American position. Instead, they seemed to be deliberately keeping the convoy trapped while maintaining their own positions of advantage on the higher ground. This suggested that they were waiting for something, possibly reinforcements or the arrival of someone important. James managed to reach them with additional medical supplies by crawling along a drainage ditch that provided some protection from enemy fire. Together, he and Sarah stabilized Davidson enough that he could be moved to the ambulance, but this required carrying him across open ground while under fire. Sarah found herself making tactical decisions that she'd never been trained for, choosing the safest route and timing their movement to coincide with periods when enemy fire was focused elsewhere. Once they had Davidson safely in the ambulance, Sarah assessed their overall situation. 3 soldiers from the security vehicles had been wounded, though none as seriously as Davidson. The convoy's vehicles were damaged but still operational, and they had enough ammunition to continue defending their position for several hours. However, their radio calls for assistance weren't being answered, suggesting that they were truly on their own until someone at the base realized they were missing. The afternoon sun was beginning to sink toward the western horizon, and Sarah realized that fighting in the mountains after dark would be nearly impossible for the trapped American forces. The enemy fighters knew the terrain intimately and would have significant advantages once visibility decreased. If the convoy was going to escape or if help was going to arrive, it needed to happen soon. During a brief lull in the fighting, Sergeant Miller crawled over to Sarah's ambulance to check on the wounded and assess their medical situation. He was a combat veteran with 3 previous deployments, but Sarah could see worry in his eyes as he explained their tactical situation. The enemy had positioned fighters in a horseshoe pattern around their position, with the open end of the horseshoe blocked by the destroyed sections of road. Miller told Sarah that he'd been trying to call for air support, but their location in the deep mountain valley was interfering with radio communications. Even if their calls were getting through, it would take at least 2 hours for attack helicopters to reach them, and probably longer for ground reinforcements. They were going to have to hold their position and hope that superior firepower and training would be enough to survive until help arrived. As the fighting resumed, Sarah found herself taking on responsibilities that went far beyond her role as an ambulance driver. She was coordinating medical care for multiple casualties, helping to distribute ammunition to soldiers whose supplies were running low, and even spotting enemy positions for the security team. Her fear was still present, but it had been overwhelmed by the immediate need to help keep everyone alive. When Private Martinez from the rear security vehicle took a bullet wound to his shoulder, Sarah didn't hesitate to leave her protected position behind the ambulance to reach him. She had noticed that several enemy fighters were concentrating their fire on the rear of the convoy, probably trying to prevent any escape in that direction. Reaching Martinez required crossing an area where she would be exposed to fire from at least 3 different enemy positions. Sarah made the run in short sprints, using whatever cover was available and timing her movements to coincide with moments when the enemy fighters were reloading or shifting their attention elsewhere. She reached Martinez successfully and was able to treat his wound, but getting back to the ambulance proved more difficult when enemy fire intensified. It was during this return trip that Sarah first fired her weapon in combat. An enemy fighter appeared on a rock ledge above her position, aiming his rifle directly at her while she was carrying Martinez toward the ambulance. Without thinking about it, Sarah drew her pistol and fired 3 shots in rapid succession. The fighter disappeared behind the rocks, and Sarah never knew whether she had hit him or simply forced him to take cover. As darkness began to fall over the mountain valley, Sarah realized that waiting for rescue was no longer a viable strategy. The enemy fighters had demonstrated remarkable patience and discipline, maintaining their positions for hours without attempting a direct assault. This suggested they were confident that time was on their side, and Sarah understood why. Once full darkness arrived, the trapped American soldiers would lose their ability to see enemy movement, while the attackers who knew every rock and path in these mountains would gain an enormous advantage. Davidson's condition was becoming more serious despite her treatment. The makeshift 4 and pressure bandages were keeping him stable, but Sarah could see signs that infection might be setting in around his wound. In a fully equipped hospital, his injury would be serious, but manageable. Trapped in a mountain valley under enemy fire, it could become life-threatening within hours. The other wounded soldiers were in better condition, but none of them were capable of fighting effectively. During a brief conversation with Sergeant Miller, Sarah learned something that changed her understanding of their situation completely. Miller had been monitoring enemy radio communications using a captured device from a previous operation, and he discovered that their attackers were part of a larger force that was planning to use this ambush as a diversion for an attack on a nearby village where American forces were providing medical care to local civilians. The realization hit Sarah like a physical blow. While they were pinned down and fighting for survival, enemy forces were preparing to attack defenseless people who were receiving medical treatment. The village clinic treated not just American soldiers, but also local children, elderly people, and anyone else who needed help. Sarah had visited that clinic twice during supply runs, and she remembered the faces of the people there. Mothers holding sick babies, elderly men with infected wounds, children who smiled despite their pain. This knowledge transformed Sarah's understanding of what was at stake. This wasn't just about surviving an enemy attack anymore. If their convoy remained trapped here, unable to call for help or break free, people would die in that village tonight. People who had never taken up arms against anyone. People whose only crime was accepting medical help from American forces. Sarah made a decision that went against every aspect of her training and personality. She was going to take offensive action to break the deadlock, even if it meant putting herself in extreme danger. The plan that formed in her mind was simple, desperate, and probably suicidal, but it was the only option she could see that might save lives both in their trapped convoy and in the threatened village. The enemy fighters had positioned themselves in a horseshoe pattern around the convoy's position, but Sarah had noticed something during her trips to treat wounded soldiers. The western end of the horseshoe, where the sun was now setting, had only 2 visible fighting positions compared to 4 or 5 positions on the eastern side. This imbalance suggested that the enemy commander was expecting any breakout attempt to go eastward, back toward the American base. Sarah's plan involved using her ambulance to break through the weaker western end of the enemy line. The ambulance was armored enough to withstand small arms fire for a short time, and its medical markings might cause enemy fighters to hesitate for a crucial few seconds. If she could break through their line and reach higher ground, she might be able to establish radio contact with the base and call in the air support that could save everyone. When she explained her plan to Sergeant Miller, his immediate response was to forbid her from attempting it. He pointed out that she was a medic, not a combat soldier, and that losing their ambulance and medical supplies could doom the wounded soldiers who depended on her care. But Sarah had already considered these objections, and she had answers that surprised both Miller and herself. She explained that James was fully qualified to provide medical care for the wounded soldiers using the supplies they'd already moved to their defensive position. The ambulance itself was becoming more of a liability than an asset as enemy fire gradually damaged its engine and tires. Most importantly, if her plan succeeded and air support arrived, all of the wounded could be evacuated within hours. If it failed, they were all likely to die anyway when the enemy attack intensified after dark. Miller listened to her reasoning and recognized the tactical logic behind her desperate plan. He also recognized something else. The quiet ambulance driver from Texas had developed combat instincts that many soldiers never acquired even after multiple deployments. Her plan was risky, but it addressed their strategic situation in a way that simply waiting for rescue could not. The preparation for Sarah's breakout attempt took 30 minutes of careful coordination. She moved essential medical supplies from her ambulance to the defensive position where James could access them. Sergeant Miller assigned 2 soldiers to provide covering fire during her initial movement, and they identified the precise route she would take to reach the enemy line and break through it. Sarah checked her personal weapon and discovered that she had only 18 rounds of ammunition remaining. This seemed woefully inadequate for what she was planning to attempt, but Miller gave her additional magazines from soldiers who wouldn't be able to use them effectively because of their wounds. She also took several hand grenades, though she'd never used one outside of training exercises. The most difficult part of her preparation was mental. Everything in her background and personality rebelled against the idea of deliberately driving toward enemy fighters with the intention of engaging them in combat. She had joined the military to save lives, not to take them. But she forced herself to remember the faces of the civilians at the village clinic, and she thought about Davidson and the other wounded soldiers who needed immediate medical care. As Sarah climbed back into her ambulance for what might be the last time, James grabbed her arm and looked directly into her eyes. He told her that she was the bravest person he'd ever served with, and that whatever happened during the next few minutes, he was honored to have been her partner. Sarah nodded, unable to trust her voice to respond, and started the ambulance's engine. The sound of the engine drew immediate enemy fire, and Sarah realized that her movements had been observed more closely than she'd hoped. Bullets struck the ambulance's hood and windshield as she put the vehicle in gear and began driving toward the western end of the enemy line. The covering fire from Miller's soldiers helped suppress some of the enemy positions, but Sarah could hear rounds hitting her vehicle with increasing frequency as she gained speed. The first 100 yards of her breakout attempt went according to plan. The ambulance's armor held up against small arms fire, and the enemy fighters seemed confused about whether she was attempting to escape or attacking their positions. But as she approached the gap between the 2 enemy positions on the western side, concentrated fire from both locations began to take its toll on her vehicle. The ambulance's windshield shattered completely, filling the cab with glass fragments, and making it nearly impossible to see the road ahead. Sarah had to drive by instinct and memory, steering around obstacles she couldn't clearly see while enemy bullets continued to strike the vehicle. The engine began making ominous sounds that suggested serious damage to vital components. Sarah's first real combat engagement began when an enemy fighter emerged from behind a large rock directly in front of her ambulance. The man was carrying an anti-tank weapon that could destroy her vehicle with a single shot, and he was positioning himself to fire at point-blank range. Sarah had perhaps 2 seconds to react before he could complete his aim and pull the trigger. Without conscious thought, Sarah jerked the steering wheel hard to the right while simultaneously drawing her pistol. The ambulance struck the enemy fighter before he could fire his weapon, but the impact sent her vehicle into a skidding turn that threatened to roll it over on the steep mountainside. Sarah fought to regain control while enemy fire intensified from the remaining position on her left. The ambulance came to a stop wedged against a boulder formation, its engine smoking and making sounds that indicated complete mechanical failure. Sarah found herself approximately 50 yards from the remaining enemy position, close enough to see the muzzle flashes from their weapons, but still unable to establish radio contact because of the surrounding mountains. Her breakout attempt had failed to achieve its primary objective, but it had accomplished something else entirely. By breaking through part of the enemy line, Sarah had changed the tactical situation for both sides. The enemy fighters could no longer maintain their organized horseshoe formation, and some of them were now exposed to fire from Sergeant Miller's position. More importantly, Sarah's actions had demonstrated that the enemy line could be broken, giving the other soldiers hope and showing them a possible escape route. But Sarah herself was now in an extremely dangerous position. Her ambulance was disabled and exposed to fire from multiple directions. She was cut off from her fellow soldiers and low on ammunition. The enemy fighters who remained in the western position were now focusing their attention entirely on her, recognizing that she posed a threat to their carefully planned ambush. Sarah made another decision that surprised herself. Instead of trying to retreat back to the convoy's defensive position, she decided to continue her attack on the remaining enemy fighters. She had come this far and risked this much. She might as well see if she could complete the mission of breaking their siege entirely. Using the disabled ambulance as cover, Sarah began a careful advance toward the enemy position. She moved from rock to rock, using every piece of natural cover available while watching for signs of enemy movement. The training that she'd tried to avoid during her military preparation suddenly became vitally important as she found herself applying lessons about tactical movement and target acquisition that she'd barely paid attention to months earlier. The enemy fighters had excellent positions among the rocks, but Sarah realized that they were making a crucial mistake. They were so focused on maintaining fire toward the trapped convoy that they weren't paying enough attention to the threat she now posed from their flank. This gave her opportunities to move closer to their position without being detected. When Sarah was within 30 yards of the enemy position, she could hear the fighters talking to each other in low voices. She couldn't understand their language, but their tone suggested they were coordinating some kind of change in tactics. This worried her because any change in their approach might involve a direct assault on the convoy's position, which could overwhelm the wounded Americans before air support could arrive. Sarah realized that she needed to act immediately before the enemy fighters could implement whatever new plan they were discussing. She checked her remaining ammunition one more time, took several deep breaths to steady her nerves, and began the most dangerous few minutes of her life. The arrival of air support transformed the battlefield in minutes. From her position on the high ground, Sarah watched as Apache attack helicopters swept through the mountain valley, their cannon fire systematically destroying the remaining enemy positions that had kept her convoy trapped for hours. The sound of the helicopter's rotors echoing off the canyon walls was the most beautiful thing she'd ever heard, because it meant that her desperate gamble had worked and help had finally arrived. Sarah's radio crackled with urgent messages from the helicopter pilots requesting target identification and confirmation of friendly positions. Drawing on knowledge she'd gained from months of coordinating medical evacuations, she provided precise coordinates and detailed descriptions that allowed the pilots to eliminate enemy threats without endangering the trapped American soldiers. Her calm, professional communication impressed the helicopter crews, who had no idea they were receiving tactical guidance from an ambulance driver with no formal combat training. Within 20 minutes of the helicopter's arrival, the remaining enemy fighters had either been eliminated or forced to retreat deeper into the mountains. Sarah watched through her binoculars as figures in dark clothing fled up steep trails that led away from the battle area. She felt no satisfaction in their retreat, only relief that the immediate threat to her fellow soldiers had ended and that medical evacuations could begin. The first medical helicopter landed near the convoy's defensive position 30 minutes after Sarah had established radio contact. She watched from her elevated position as James and the other medics carefully loaded Davidson and the other wounded soldiers aboard the aircraft. Even from a distance, she could see that Davidson was conscious and responsive, which meant her field treatment had been successful in keeping him stable until professional medical care could arrive. Sergeant Miller's voice came over her radio, requesting her immediate return to the convoy's position for evacuation. But Sarah found herself reluctant to leave the high ground where she'd fought her most important battle. Something fundamental had changed during those few minutes when she'd attacked the enemy position, and she needed time to understand what it meant for her future as a soldier and as a person. The physical evidence of what she'd accomplished was scattered around the rocky position where the enemy fighters had made their stand. Abandoned weapons, ammunition, and equipment told the story of how quickly her assault had overwhelmed their defenses. Sarah had never imagined that she was capable of such aggressive and effective action, and seeing the results of her combat skills was both empowering and deeply unsettling. When Sarah finally made her way back down to the convoy's position, she found that word of her actions had already spread to the other soldiers. These were experienced fighters who had seen combat in multiple deployments, but they looked at her with a new respect that made her uncomfortable. She had never wanted to be seen as a warrior, and the admiration in their eyes forced her to confront the reality of what she had become. James approached her with a mixture of pride and concern on his face. He had known her better than anyone else in their unit, and he could see that something fundamental had changed in her during the battle. The quiet, gentle medic who had avoided conflict whenever possible had been replaced by someone who had demonstrated remarkable tactical intelligence and ruthless effectiveness in combat situations. The debriefing that followed their return to base lasted several hours and involved officers from multiple units who wanted to understand exactly how an enemy ambush had been defeated by a medical support team with minimal combat training. Sarah found herself explaining tactical decisions and combat techniques that she had improvised during the battle, many of which impressed the experienced infantry officers who conducted her interview. Major Thompson, her commanding officer, listened to Sarah's account with growing amazement. He had known her as a reliable and skilled ambulance driver, but the person describing advanced combat tactics and split-second tactical decisions seemed like a completely different soldier. He made notes throughout her debriefing that would later become the foundation for several changes in military training protocols. The most difficult part of the debriefing involved Sarah's description of the moments when she had used lethal force against enemy fighters. Military psychologists were present to assess her emotional state and provide support for any trauma she might be experiencing. But Sarah found that her primary emotion was not guilt or regret, but rather a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness that she struggled to explain. She told the psychologist that she felt satisfied because her actions had saved lives and prevented an attack on innocent civilians. But she also felt sad because using violence had proven to be so natural for her once she made the decision to embrace it. The discovery that she possessed significant combat abilities forced her to question fundamental assumptions about her own nature and capabilities. News of Sarah's actions spread quickly throughout the base and then to higher levels of military command. Within a week, she received requests for interviews from military journalists who wanted to document her story for training purposes and public relations. Sarah declined most of these requests, feeling uncomfortable with the attention and uncertain about how she wanted her military service to be remembered. The wounded soldiers she had helped save were more successful in their recovery than anyone had initially expected. Davidson kept his leg and eventually returned to active duty, though he was assigned to a training position rather than combat operations. Private Martinez recovered completely from his shoulder wound and specifically requested assignment to Sarah's unit for the remainder of his deployment. The most significant immediate consequence of Sarah's actions was a change in her official military assignment. Major Thompson informed her that she was being reassigned from ambulance driver to tactical medical coordinator, a newly created position that would involve planning and coordinating medical support for complex operations in dangerous areas. The promotion came with increased rank, additional responsibilities, and significantly more combat training. Sarah's reaction to this promotion was complicated. She appreciated the recognition of her abilities and the opportunity to help save more lives through better planning and coordination. But she also worried that accepting a more combat-oriented role would take her further away from the direct patient care that had originally motivated her to join the military medical service. During her first week in the new position, Sarah participated in planning sessions for future operations that might involve medical support in hostile areas. Her experiences during the ambush had given her insights into the challenges faced by medical teams in combat situations, and her recommendations were incorporated into several new protocols that would better protect medics and improve patient outcomes. The psychological evaluation that followed her combat experience revealed something that surprised both Sarah and the military psychologists who examined her. Rather than showing signs of post-traumatic stress or other combat-related mental health issues, Sarah demonstrated enhanced confidence and improved decision-making abilities. The experience of succeeding under extreme pressure had actually strengthened her psychological resilience. However, the evaluation also revealed that Sarah was struggling with questions about her identity and future goals. The person who had joined the military to help people without hurting anyone had discovered that sometimes helping and hurting were inseparable. She needed to develop a new understanding of how violence could be a tool for protecting innocent people rather than simply a means of causing harm. Sarah's family noticed the changes in her personality during their weekly phone calls. Her mother commented that she sounded more confident and decisive, but also more serious and thoughtful than before. When Sarah tried to explain what had happened during the ambush, she found that the experience was difficult to communicate to people who had never faced life or death situations where split-second decisions determined who lived and who died. The most profound change in Sarah's perspective involved her understanding of courage and heroism. Before the ambush, she had thought of courage as the willingness to help others despite personal risk. After the ambush, she understood that true courage sometimes required making choices that went against your natural instincts and personal preferences in order to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. Letters from the civilians at the village clinic that had been threatened during the enemy attack provided Sarah with confirmation that her actions had saved innocent lives. The village elder wrote to thank her specifically for preventing an attack that could have killed dozens of people who had been receiving medical treatment. Reading these letters helped Sarah understand that her transformation from medic to fighter had served a higher purpose. 3 weeks after the ambush, Sarah received official notice. The final 3 months of Sarah's deployment passed more quietly than she had expected, but the change in how others saw her was constant and sometimes overwhelming. Soldiers throughout the base knew her story, and she found herself being consulted on tactical matters that had nothing to do with medical care. Officers from other units would seek her opinion on convoy security, defensive positioning, and how to maintain morale during extended combat operations. Sarah's new role as tactical medical coordinator allowed her to implement several innovations that improved survival rates for wounded soldiers throughout the region. She developed new protocols for medical evacuations in hostile territory, created training programs that taught basic combat skills to medical personnel, and established better communication systems between medical teams and combat units. Each improvement was based on lessons she had learned during those desperate hours when her convoy was trapped. The most satisfying aspect of her new responsibilities was the opportunity to train other medics in combat survival techniques. Sarah found that she could relate to their reluctance to engage in combat training, having experienced those same feelings herself. But she could also explain why such skills might become necessary to save lives, using her own experience as proof that avoiding combat training could ultimately put patients at risk. During one of these training sessions, Sarah worked with a young medic named Specialist Rodriguez who reminded her strongly of herself 6 months earlier. Rodriguez was an excellent medical technician, but struggled with weapons training and seemed uncomfortable with any discussion of combat tactics. Sarah spent extra time with her, explaining how medical duties and combat skills could complement rather than contradict each other. The conversation with Rodriguez helped Sarah understand how much her own perspective had evolved. She found herself explaining that protecting patients sometimes required being willing to fight for them, and that avoiding violence completely wasn't always possible when innocent lives were at stake. These were lessons that the Sarah Martinez who had first arrived in Afghanistan would have struggled to accept, but they had become fundamental parts of her worldview. As her deployment neared its end, Sarah received several offers to extend her service or accept assignments that would allow her to continue developing her unique combination of medical and tactical skills. Special operations units were interested in her abilities, and medical training commands wanted her to help develop new programs for combat medics. All of these opportunities represented significant career advancement and the chance to continue serving her country in important ways. But Sarah found herself thinking more and more about home, about her family in Sweetwater, and about the original reasons she had joined the military. The transformation she had undergone in Afghanistan had been necessary and valuable, but she wondered whether she could maintain her sense of who she really was if she continued down a path that emphasized combat over healing. The person she had become was stronger and more capable than the person she had been, but was she still the same person at heart? The decision became clearer when Sarah received a letter from her brother Miguel informing her that he had decided not to enlist in the military after all. Instead, he had been accepted to a community college program that would prepare him to become a paramedic. He wrote that Sarah's example had shown him how important it was to help people during emergencies, but that he preferred to do so in civilian settings where the primary focus was always on saving lives rather than fighting enemies. Reading Miguel's letter forced Sarah to confront the question of what example she wanted to set and what kind of person she wanted to be after her military service ended. The skills she had developed in combat were valuable and could serve important purposes, but they weren't necessarily the skills she wanted to define her for the rest of her life. She had proven that she could be a warrior when circumstances demanded it, but that didn't mean she had to remain a warrior forever. Sarah made the decision to complete her current enlistment and return to civilian life, where she planned to use her military medical training to become a nurse or paramedic. She declined the offers for extended service and special assignments, explaining that she had learned what she needed to learn about herself and was ready to apply those lessons in a different context. The farewell ceremony for soldiers completing their deployments was held on a clear morning in early spring, when the Afghan mountains looked almost peaceful in the distance. Sarah stood in formation with dozens of other soldiers who had served their country with honor and were now ready to return home. As she listened to the formal speeches about duty, sacrifice, and service, she reflected on how much she had changed since arriving at this same base almost a year earlier. The flight home took 36 hours with multiple stops, giving Sarah plenty of time to think about how she would explain her experiences to people who had never faced similar challenges. She had decided to be honest about what had happened during the ambush and how it had changed her, but she also wanted to emphasize that the most important aspect of her transformation was learning how courage could be applied to protecting others rather than simply fighting enemies. Sarah's homecoming at the Dallas airport was emotional and overwhelming. Her family had arranged for what seemed like half of Sweetwater to be present when she arrived, including teachers from her old high school, neighbors she had grown up with, and friends who had followed her military service through letters and social media posts. The attention was gratifying, but also uncomfortable for someone who had never sought recognition for her actions. The local newspaper wanted to interview Sarah about her military service and her decoration for valor, but she insisted that the focus should be on all military medical personnel rather than her individual actions. She used the interview as an opportunity to talk about the importance of supporting veterans' health care and ensuring that military medics received adequate training for the complex situations they might face in combat zones. Returning to civilian life presented unexpected challenges for Sarah. The intensity and constant alertness required in a combat zone had become second nature to her, and adjusting to the slower pace and reduced sense of purpose in civilian environments proved difficult. She found herself missing the clear mission and immediate importance of her military duties, even though she didn't miss the danger and stress of combat operations. Sarah enrolled in a nursing program at a community college in San Antonio, where she could live with relatives while pursuing her education. The academic work was manageable given her military medical training, but she struggled with the social aspects of civilian college life. Students her age seemed focused on concerns that appeared trivial after her experiences in Afghanistan, and she had difficulty relating to their priorities and perspectives. The most helpful part of her transition to civilian life was volunteer work with a veterans organization that provided support services to returning military personnel. Working with other veterans who had faced similar challenges gave Sarah a sense of community and purpose that helped bridge the gap between her military and civilian identities. She found that her combat experience made her particularly effective at helping veterans who were struggling with PTSD or adjustment disorders. One of the veterans Sarah worked with was a former infantry soldier named David Chun, who had served multiple deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan. David had been struggling with anxiety and depression since returning home, and traditional counseling approaches hadn't been effective for him. Sarah's combination of military experience and medical knowledge allowed her to understand his challenges in ways that civilian counselors couldn't match. Through her work with David and other veterans, Sarah discovered a new sense of mission that combined her medical interests with her military experience. She began to see how the leadership and tactical thinking skills she had developed in combat could be applied to helping veterans navigate the complex challenges of returning to civilian life. This realization helped her understand that her transformation in Afghanistan could serve positive purposes in peacetime environments. Sarah's nursing school clinical rotations took place at a trauma center in San Antonio, where her military medical experience proved invaluable in high-pressure emergency situations. Her supervisors noted her exceptional composure under pressure and her ability to make rapid, accurate assessments of complex medical situations. Several attending physicians commented that she showed the kind of clinical judgment that usually took years to develop. During one particularly challenging shift, Sarah found herself treating multiple casualties from a serious traffic accident that had occurred during a thunderstorm. The situation reminded her of treating wounded soldiers under enemy fire, but instead of focusing on the similarities, she concentrated on how the skills she had learned in combat could be applied to saving civilian lives. The experience confirmed her decision to pursue a career in emergency medicine. As Sarah approached graduation from nursing school, she received an unexpected phone call from Major Thompson, her former commanding officer in Afghanistan. He was now working at a military hospital in Texas and wanted to offer her a position as a civilian contractor providing combat medical training to military personnel. The job would allow her to use her unique combination of skills while remaining in civilian status and pursuing her nursing career. The offer represented exactly the kind of opportunity Sarah had been hoping for, a way to contribute to military medical care while maintaining her civilian identity and continuing her education in emergency nursing. She accepted the position and found that teaching combat medical techniques to military personnel was both professionally satisfying and personally meaningful. In her training sessions with military medics, Sarah emphasized the importance of maintaining focus on the medical mission even in combat situations. She taught them that being prepared to fight when necessary didn't mean abandoning their primary role as healers, but rather ensuring that they could continue healing even under the most challenging circumstances. Her approach helped bridge the gap between medical and combat training in ways that benefited both aspects of military service. 3 years after returning from Afghanistan, Sarah had established herself as a respected emergency room nurse and a valued instructor in combat medical training. She had found a way to integrate the different aspects of her identity: the gentle healer who wanted to help people, the tactical thinker who could solve complex problems under pressure, and the warrior who could fight when protecting others required it. The transformation that had begun during those desperate hours when her convoy was trapped in the Afghan mountains had evolved into an integrated understanding of how strength and compassion could work together to serve others. Sarah had learned that sometimes the most effective way to save lives was to be willing to risk your own, and that courage wasn't the absence of fear but rather the decision to act in spite of fear when others depended on you. Looking back on her military service, Sarah understood that the ambush in the mountain valley had been a defining moment not just because of what she had accomplished, but because of what it had taught her about her own capabilities and responsibilities. She had discovered that ordinary people could rise to meet extraordinary challenges when the stakes were high enough and the cause was worth the risk. The quiet girl from Sweetwater, Texas, who had joined the military to help people without hurting anyone, had become a woman who understood that sometimes helping and protecting were inseparable, and that true strength came from being willing to do whatever was necessary to save innocent lives. This understanding would guide her for the rest of her life, in both her professional work and her personal relationships, as she continued to serve others in whatever capacity circumstances required. Vacation that she was being recommended for the Silver Star, one of the military's highest decorations for combat valor. The recommendation cited her initiative, tactical intelligence, and selfless courage in breaking an enemy ambush that had threatened both military personnel and civilian lives. Sarah's reaction to this news was characteristically modest. She felt that she had simply done what needed to be done in an impossible situation. The medal ceremony took place at the main base in a formal setting that brought together soldiers from multiple units. As Sarah stood at attention while the Silver Star was pinned to her uniform, she thought about how far she had traveled from the quiet girl who had joined the military to avoid hurting anyone. The journey had been painful and transformative, but it had led her to discoveries about herself that she could never have made in peaceful circumstances. After the ceremony, Sergeant Miller approached Sarah to tell her something that he hadn't included in his official reports. During the most intense moments of the ambush, when it seemed like the entire convoy might be overrun, several soldiers had been preparing to make desperate individual escape attempts that probably would have resulted in their capture or death. Sarah's decisive action and successful breakout had prevented these potentially suicidal decisions by demonstrating that organized resistance could succeed. The knowledge that her courage had inspired others to maintain discipline and hope during a desperate situation added another dimension to Sarah's understanding of leadership and responsibility. She began to see that her role as a protector extended beyond direct medical care to include providing an example of how ordinary people could rise to meet extraordinary challenges. As her deployment in Afghanistan approached its final months, Sarah found herself serving as an informal mentor to newer soldiers who were struggling with the psychological challenges of military service in a combat zone. Her combination of medical knowledge, combat experience, and genuine concern for others made her uniquely qualified to help soldiers who were experiencing doubt, fear, or uncertainty about their ability to serve effectively. The transformation that had begun during those desperate hours when her convoy was trapped in the mountain valley had evolved into a new understanding of how individual actions could have far-reaching consequences for protecting innocent people and supporting fellow soldiers. Sarah had discovered that sometimes the most important battles were fought not by professional warriors, but by ordinary people who found extraordinary courage when lives depended on their choices. The attack she launched on the enemy position was unlike anything she could have imagined herself doing 6 months earlier. Using hand grenades to force the fighters to take cover, she advanced rapidly from one position to another while firing her weapon with an accuracy that surprised her. The months of driving through dangerous terrain had developed her spatial awareness and reaction time in ways that translated perfectly to combat situations. The enemy fighters were caught completely off guard by her assault. They had been focused on the larger threat from the convoy, and none of them expected a single soldier to attack their fortified position. Sarah's aggressive tactics and the covering fire from Sergeant Miller's soldiers overwhelmed the remaining fighters within minutes. When the firing stopped, Sarah found herself in control of the high ground overlooking the entire battle area. Her radio, which had been useless in the valley below, immediately picked up clear signals from the base. Within minutes, she had established contact with air support and provided precise coordinates for the remaining enemy positions that were still threatening her fellow soldiers. The transformation was complete. Sarah Martinez, the ambulance driver who had avoided combat training and never wanted to hurt anyone, had single-handedly changed the outcome of a complex enemy ambush. But, more importantly, she had prevented an attack on defenseless civilians and saved the lives of soldiers who had trusted her to bring them home safely. The physical act of firing her weapon changed something fundamental in Sarah's mindset. The reluctance to use violence that had characterized her throughout training evaporated in the face of an immediate threat to her own life and the lives of the soldiers depending on her. She realized that in this situation, her commitment to saving lives required her to be willing to take them when necessary. By late afternoon, the convoy had been under attack for nearly 3 hours. All of the wounded soldiers were stable, but Sarah knew that Davidson needed surgery within the next few hours or he might lose his leg. The enemy fire had decreased somewhat, but the fighters were clearly maintaining their positions and waiting for darkness to provide them with additional tactical advantages. Sarah began to understand that their survival might depend on actions that went beyond simply holding their defensive position. The enemy had chosen the time and place for this attack carefully, and they seemed confident that they could maintain their siege until the trapped Americans either ran out of ammunition or made a desperate attempt to break out that would expose them to devastating crossfire. As the sun continued to sink toward the mountains in the west, Sarah made a decision that would define the rest of her military career and her life afterward. She realized that someone would have to take the initiative to change the tactical situation, and the only person in a position to do so was the one person in the convoy who wasn't expected to fight, the ambulance driver who just wanted to save lives. Early snow, Sarah prepared for what she thought would be just another routine medical evacuation mission. The request had come from an outpost 30 miles away where a soldier had been injured in a training accident and needed immediate transport to the main hospital. It seemed straightforward. Drive out with her usual security escort, pick up the patient, and return before nightfall. She spent extra time checking her ambulance that morning, ensuring all medical equipment was properly secured and that her communication equipment was functioning perfectly. James helped her load additional supplies, joking that she was preparing as if she expected to be gone for a week instead of a few hours. Sarah laughed along with his jokes, but something felt different about this mission. She couldn't explain why, but her instincts were telling her to be extra careful. She decided to pack additional emergency supplies, including extra food and water, just in case weather or road conditions delayed their return. As she climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine, Sarah looked back at the base one more time. The American flag snapped in the cold wind above the main building, and soldiers were going about their normal routines, some heading to the mess hall for lunch, others cleaning equipment or talking in small groups. Everything looked completely normal, exactly like dozens of other mornings since she'd arrived. She radioed her departure time to the base communications center and pulled out of the motor pool, following the security vehicles that would escort her convoy. Behind her, 2 more vehicles filled with additional security personnel fell into formation. As they passed through the base's main gate and onto the mountain road that led to their destination, Sarah waved to the guards and settled in for what she expected to be a routine mission. The road stretched ahead through rugged terrain, winding between rocky outcroppings and past steep drop-offs that fell hundreds of feet to the valley below. Sarah had driven this route several times before and knew it would take about 90 minutes to reach their destination if they maintained a steady pace and didn't encounter any obstacles. What she didn't know was that enemy forces had been watching this route for weeks, studying the timing and patterns of military convoys. They had chosen this particular day to launch an attack that would test every skill Sarah had learned and force her to discover capabilities she never knew she possessed. The quiet girl from Sweetwater, Texas, who had joined the military to help people without hurting anyone, was about to face a situation where helping and hurting would become impossible to separate.